Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Matt Ridley today, or should I say Lord Ridley. Matt Ridley is a former science and technology editor for the Economist magazine, a journalist and best-selling author. Matt Ridley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Juliet, it's
great
to join you.
For all of my listeners who don't know, you're in England right now, right?
I'm in the north of England, near Newcastle.
Before I turn to your book, The Rational Optimist, I want to ask you a question that I ask all of my guests. What is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
That a terrible pandemic is going to happen in 2020. No, that's no good, is it? Because you know that already. I think the most important thing you need to know is that the world is a bottom-up place. That is to say that the most important things that happen in the world emerge from below. They don't get imposed from above by clever people. They emerge from below through the interactions of ordinary people dealing with each other, exchanging goods and ideas and services with each other. So the world is a much more... The world is not created, designed or planned to anything like the extent we grown-ups pretend.
This kind of is a topic you talk about in some of your books. Today, specifically, I would like to talk to you about The Rational Optimist. It came out about 10 years ago, but still remains very relevant. In the first section, you talk about how ideas have sex. To my listeners who haven't read this book, you guys can listen to the TED Talk with the same name. What do you mean by this?
Well, it's a metaphor, but it's actually quite a direct metaphor, because sex is a very important part of the process by which innovation happens inside genes, inside genomes, inside individuals in their biological sense. So what sex does is it mixes up genes from the father with the mother and then recombines them and shuffles them before passing them on to the next generation. And that means that good ideas that come down from your father can meet good ideas that come down from your mother. And when I say ideas, I mean genetic programs, and can get combined. So you end up with both, the best of both worlds. That's what sex does in biology. And my argument is that without that, evolution would not be a cumulative phenomenon in which lots of different good ideas get accreted on until you have an organism that is fully equipped for dealing with the world in a very clever way. And that much the same happens in human society through the process of exchange, of trade, of swapping things. I do what I'm good at, you do what you're good at, and we exchange, we combine, and the result is exactly like sex in biology, that we're able to make the world a cumulative place where a good idea that occurs to someone in California can meet a good idea that occurs to someone in China and be combined to make a product that has both good ideas in it. So that's what I mean by ideas having sex. It's a cheeky metaphor designed to catch people's attention, but it's actually really quite a serious and specific parallel with what happens in biology.
In this section of your book, you say that it's the secret behind human progress. I quote, "Look at the hand hack and a computer mouse. One was made by a single person and the other was made by hundreds of people and maybe even millions." Can you explain what you mean when you say that the computer mouse was made by millions? and what that has to do with ideas having sex?
Well, in contrast with a stone tool, a computer mouse is made of different substances, plastic, silicon, metal, and embodies different ideas: the idea of computing, the idea of software, the idea of plastic. And these ideas occur to different people at different times and in different places, and they got combined in this device. So the device draws upon the knowledge of lots of different people. But it also quite directly draws upon the manufacturing skills of lots of different people, because the mouse is made in a mouse factory, but it's not made from scratch in the factory. It's made from pieces of plastic, pieces of metal, pieces of silicon, and so on. And those pieces originated in another factory, and those raw materials originated in an oil well or a mine or somewhere like that. And at each of this stage, lots and lots of people were involved in putting together the process of creating a simple device like a mouse or a pencil, because this I'm really borrowing an idea from a famous essay called I Pencil, about a pencil who tries to work out how he was created. And when you think about it, you've got to include the guy who's growing coffee on a farm so that the coffee can be drunk by the person who's on the oil rig, who's drilling for oil, whose oil is going to go to a refinery where some of it's going to end up being made into plastic, and the plastic is going to be shipped to the mouse factory, and in the mouse factory it's going to be molded into the right shape, and so on. And among these millions of people who help to make a simple device like a mouse, there is not one who knows how to make a computer mouse. Um, the knowledge isn't held inside an individual head. It's held between heads. It's held among heads. And that's the secret of our success as a species, is this huge collective distributed brain that we operate in the cloud, if you like. It's very explicit now in the internet, but we've been doing it essentially for a very long time in some way or another.
In another quote from your book, you write that, quote, human progress has been a good thing, and the world is as good as it has ever been to the average human being. This is where your optimism comes in. The book has been out for many years now, and omitting for now the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, have you had any reason to change your mind about that statement?
I have not. In fact, in the 10 years since the book came out, I have felt more and more vindicated by that proposition, because I wrote that book in the middle of a great recession, the great financial crisis. And a lot of people were saying, this is the end of civilization, this is the end of prosperity. In fact, the 10 years since then have seen an acceleration in the loss of extreme poverty. The number of people in extreme poverty in the world has been going down even faster in the last 10 years. And that's despite all the bad things that have nonetheless happened. We've had wars in Syria and Ukraine. We've had uh, uh, all sorts of other problems happening during this decade. And every time I went to talk about this book in the last 10 years, somebody would stand up and say, yes, but what about the Eurozone crisis? Yes, but what about the war in Syria? And I would say these are bad things. Yes, bad things do happen. But overall, the world is getting steadily better. And that has been true. Now, can I continue to say that in the middle of a global pandemic that is probably crashing the world economy even worse than the great financial crisis? Yes, I think I can, because I think we will come through this and we will rebuild. We will have to be, there will be a huge amount of suffering, both physical suffering and financial suffering along the way. And it might be really very bad indeed. But that doesn't mean the world as a whole will start to get worse and worse after that, because once we have conquered this virus, we will then be able to rebuild. The process by which human beings bring each other prosperity through exchanging and sharing ideas will continue. Um, and one of the things that I think about this pandemic is that now I understand. I've spent the last few weeks delving into the literature in about bats and viruses in China, and the warnings were there. We should have seen this coming. We should have been much better prepared for this. Um, and it wasn't because we were delightedly thinking everything was fine in a sort of Panglossian way. It was because we were worried about the wrong things. We were going on about certain problems, and we had ignored the problems of pandemics.
So, other than the fact that we're kind of in the middle of this crisis right now, You have been making an argument for optimism for years. You've been screaming from the rooftops for people to stop being so alarmed about everything. Who do you think needs to listen to you? Kids my age, people your age, politicians, everyone?
Teachers, teachers in particular. Um, I think the most important thing is for young people to be told that a counsel of despair about the future of the planet is almost certainly wrong. And also, the thing I find most useful when I'm talking to people your age is to tell them, you know, when I was your age, the grown ups told me the world was doomed then. And they were wrong. They told me the population explosion was unstoppable, a famine was inevitable, millions of people were going to die, pesticides were going to cause so much pollution and cancer, they were going to shorten our lifespan. The desert was advancing, the rainforest was retreating, species were going extinct, the pollution in the oceans and the rivers and the air was getting worse and worse and worse. Sperm counts were falling. Nothing but disaster. And I was genuinely depressed by this. I was very pessimistic as a teenager and a young adult because I thought the world was doomed. And then when I got out into the real world, I began to see that actually my country was beginning to prosper. And so were other countries. And it wasn't all getting worse. And in fact, lifespan was increasing at the rate of 5 hours a day, and child mortality was declining. And income was increasing all around the world, and poor people were getting less poor, and war was retreating. And so I began to feel really quite angry that I'd been told only gloomy things about the future. And I look at what's being said to your generation, Juliet, right now, by things like the Extinction Rebellion movement and Greta Thunberg and those people who influence her. And I think it's very irresponsible. They are not giving a balanced account. They're not making it clear that though we have problems, yes, we have problems. The world is not perfect. We are nonetheless getting better and better at solving them. And on the whole, life has never been as good for any generation. In my lifetime, the number of people who live in extreme poverty, the percentage of the world population that lives in extreme poverty, corrected for inflation, has gone down from over half to under 10%. Nobody has ever had a lifetime that good in terms of the decline of extreme poverty. And why is that not being transmitted as a fact to young people? Why are they only hearing the bad news and the pessimism? It's because bad news is newsworthy. Bad news is sudden. Bad news is exciting. Bad news catches people's attention. Good news does none of those things. So there is a natural tendency to spread the bad news, and you sound wise if you sound gloomy. Never quite understood why.
That's very interesting. I think I know personally that a lot of everything we hear is just bad, but then, I mean, you look at statistics, you hear stuff like what you said about how we've been doing better, and it's just very interesting to look at how actually we're so much better off now. So, now let's dive further into the evidence for your optimism. Again, in your book, you wrote that, quote, we are richer, healthier, and kinder than people were in the past. Can you give the most striking examples for each of these, starting with how we're richer?
Yeah. Uh, so let me give you a very clear example of how much richer we are. The average person today, if they want to switch on a lamp to read a book for an hour, will have to work for about a third of a second on the average wage to earn enough money to to buy that much light from a LED lamp. Okay? Third of a second of
Okay.
work will get you an hour of light. In 1800, the average person on the average wage would have had to work for 6 hours to get that much light from a tallow candle. That's an example of the incredible improvement in wealth. Um, what about health? Um, uh, I think the most striking thing is lifespan. 150 years ago, the lifespan of people in America was about 40 years old. You Most people only lived that long. Today, it's about 80 years old. That's a doubling of lifespan. And on the whole, people are far less likely to encounter infectious disease during that time, far less likely to die of heart disease, less likely to die of cancer at any given age. Age corrected cancer is declining in most cases, particularly things like lung cancer as we get rid of smoking. So, in almost every respect, people are healthier than they were 150 years ago. And they don't have to live with the sorts of deficiencies and infections that debilitated them throughout their lives. Um, you know, you don't have worms, you don't have lice, you don't have all those sort of things that may sound a bit trivial, but they also carried very serious diseases. And actually, some of the problems we do have today in health, like asthma and allergies, are much worse. The reason we have those is because we've got rid of the parasites. This is very clear now. The evidence is very strong on this, that if you get rid of worms from people, then they get allergies instead. Their immune system reacts to environmental factors instead. I can't remember what the third one you wanted to know was. It was wealth, health, and
Kinder.
kindness.
How we're kinder, yeah.
Yes. Well, Steven Pinker wrote a wonderful book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he went through how violence of all kinds is declining. Warfare, um, uh, domestic violence, everything you can think of, animal cruelty, it's all declining. It's all retreating all the time. And it's becoming less and less acceptable to do some of the things that we used to do happily in the past and think of as routine. I think the warfare one is really striking because we hear about wars. We think that we've just had a really, really bad war in Syria, and we have. The world has had a very bad war in Syria, and some really brutal things have happened on our television screens, and people have had their throats cut, and so on. This was routine for most of history. And right up until the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was very common around the world. Today, there are, I think Steven Pinker says, about 11 wars still happening in the world. Sounds like a lot. It's the lowest number ever, and not one of them is in the Western Hemisphere. With the signing of a peace treaty in, I think, Colombia recently, that brought to an end the last war in the Western Hemisphere. Um, Africa. When I was young, Africa was in a state of pretty well constant warfare in different countries, in Angola, in Mozambique, in the Congo, uh, in Ethiopia, and so on. There are still problems going on in Africa, but they're nothing like as bad as they were. In fact, in the last 10 years, Africans have seen the sorts of improvements in their lifestyles that happened in Asia 20 years before that. So Ethiopians have doubled their average income in the last 10 years, whereas Italians have decreased their average income in the last 10 years. So Ethiopians are catching up with Italians. People in poor countries are getting rich faster than people in rich countries. And so global inequality is going down. And that's also a source of great comfort.
So it seems like you have pretty great evidence for why to be optimistic about innovation and growth. Um, so, apart from the evidence, let's turn to how we got there, how we grew and stuff. You talk about how, quote, barter was the trick that changed the world, end quote. I have to say, it's pretty interesting for someone my age to hear about barter because I have never bartered, and I don't think you probably haven't bartered. But I haven't even had to pay for anything with real cash. We have credit cards, Venmo, PayPal, cryptocurrencies. Can you explain why barter was so instrumental to our current state, our current prosperity?
Yeah, I think, ask yourself the question, why does prosperity happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? Um, it doesn't make sense to talk about economic growth in any other species. And the crucial difference is that our species has this fanatical habit of exchange. I'll give you a bit of what you want, and you give me a bit of I want. Now, I barter all the time. It doesn't look like it. What I do is I sell my services. Write a newspaper article or I write a book and I sell it to provide you with the book to read. And you then buy it, and the money you spend on buying it works its way back to me. That's a deal, if you like. That concept is completely foreign to other animals. Adam Smith famously said, "No man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog." And if you look at young human beings, we call them children, they love sharing. They love saying, "Would you like some of my cake? Can I have some of yours?" And there's very interesting. There's a primatologist who tried to raise chimpanzee, no, orangutans. Biruti Galdikas was her name. Tried to raise orangutans alongside her children, and she said one of the problems was that the orangutans just couldn't get the concept of sharing. Even if they had too much of something, they didn't want to give it away, and even if they just it just didn't come naturally to them. And somebody else tried an experiment with chimpanzees to try and give the chimpanzees, lots of carrots, which they quite like, and um, uh, offer them some grapes, which they do like even more, but only if they'll give you a carrot. And they just couldn't get the point. The chimpanzees couldn't get the point. Whereas all human societies do this. All human societies, even ones like Tierra del Fuego or Tasmania, which were contacted as late as the 1800s by Western people, knew immediately that the first thing you do when Captain Cook or someone like that sails up your creek is you offer him something in exchange for whatever he's got. Trading starts almost at once. It's a sort of human universal habit. And I think it's responsible for us becoming specialized at what we do. If you think about it, what we do these days is we get more and more specialized in what we produce, more and more narrow in what we produce. We call it a job. I mean, all I produce is books, nothing else. Um, and then as a result of that, we can become more and more diversified in what we consume. Every other animal has to produce what it consumes. Whereas if the only thing I could consume was books, then I'd be in deep trouble. You can't eat a book. I can swap my books for food. I can swap them for movies. I can swap them for clothes. I can swap them for, um, uh, I don't know, uh, anything you can buy on Amazon, if you like. So that's the
So,
argument for barter. Barter is the original form of exchange.
so without barter, we'd kind of be where other animals would be. We wouldn't have gotten to this point.
Yes, I think having a big brain was not the secret of human success. We had quite big brains 2 million years ago, just about as big as today, and we were still just an ordinary predator roaming around killing the odd animal. But then we went from that to a tremendously dominant technology creating, science understanding, art making species that dominates the planet. And we did that not by being individually clever, but by being collectively clever through barter and exchange.
We seem to live in a world where the government and governments are trying to prevent people from experimenting, from innovating. Not innovating, not claiming that they're stopping innovation, but in effect, it seems like that's what happens. Governments worry about people making mistakes, especially if there are undesirable consequences. About like stuff like drug safety and vaccine developments, medical devices. Do you think that governments can be a risk that gets in the way of progress?
I think it's very clear that while government is often well intentioned, it often becomes a tool by which vested interests prevent the introduction of new habits, new devices, new technologies. And in my forthcoming book, which is called How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom, I point out that government has often been against innovation. That's the reason why empires are very bad at innovation, because empires have strong governments. And things like coffee, when coffee was first introduced to Europe in the 1500s, governments everywhere tried to stop it. They tried to stop it partly because the wine industry wanted them to stop it, and they tried to stop it partly because they knew that in coffee shops people would sit around having conversations, and those conversations might be about why the government was doing a bad job. So the government didn't like that idea, so it tried to stop it for that reason. And that's a very cartoonish example, but funnily enough, the same thing is happening today. If you look at what goes on, there are everything from consumer goods to medical devices to vaccines are harder and harder to produce because government has brought in regulations. Now, sometimes that's to make it safer, but quite often it's pretending it's making something safer, but actually what it's doing is creating a barrier to entry on behalf of an incumbent device. I'll give you a simple example. Vaping, that is to say, electronic cigarettes, um, uh, are a device by which people can give up smoking, and they're much safer than smoking. If you try and vape tobacco, sorry, not tobacco, nicotine, then you are much less likely to do yourself harm than if you smoke. Um, so governments took one look at this and said, hang on, we must ban this technology. And, the Indian government recently banned it in collaboration with the World Health Organization. And the fact that some people had misused vaping devices in the United States with dangerous substances in them when trying to smoke cannabis rather than nicotine was used as an excuse for this. In fact, the evidence suggests from a country like the UK that this technology has saved millions of lives already. Well, certainly hundreds of thousands, because it's enabled people who were trying to quit smoking to do so more successfully. So the governments, not everything government does is bad, and not every regulation to stop innovation is a bad idea. We don't want proliferation of nuclear weapons, for example, but it's surprising how often government puts up barriers, whether through intellectual property or regulation or occupational licensing, that makes it hard for people to introduce new devices, new technologies. The licensing a new medical device takes many, many months, and many people don't even try. And we're now seeing how dangerous that is, because a lot of the testing equipment for the virus in this pandemic has been held up and is not available because it's been very hard to develop it, largely because of regulations. So, trial and error is how we do our innovation, and we need to allow that to flourish.
Can you explain why trial and error is so important to progress?
It's just an empirical fact about the world. In other words, if you go and ask inventors, how did you come up with that brilliant suggestion? They don't say, I went up a mountain and I sat cross legged for 3 days thinking. And when I came down, I had the whole thing perfectly organized. They said, I tried this and it didn't work. And I tried that and it didn't work. And I tried the other and that didn't work either. But I then got an idea and I tried something else. And eventually I hit on it. Edison tried 6,000 different types of plant material to make the filament for a light bulb. And he eventually found a type of Japanese bamboo whose plant whose fibers made a perfect light bulb filament. And he's not alone. All innovators talk about the importance of trial and error. Um, and of course, that's how Mother Nature does innovation too. That's how natural selection works. That's how evolution works. It doesn't come up with one perfect solution in a bang. It tries different things, some of which work and some of which don't. And the good ones are kept and the bad ones are discarded. And then the good ones are experimented with again. And again, you go through the same process. And it's a beautiful, beautiful system that we use for devising solutions to problems. And so does Mother Nature use it. So it's very much an evolutionary phenomenon, trial and error. Trial and error is another word for natural selection.
So, kind of going back to ideas of barter and commerce and stuff, um, people don't only exchange goods, but they exchange ideas, as you wrote in your book. They innovate. The more we're around people, the more we can learn from others and come up with new ideas. We can improve our lives. In your book, you make the case that All human achievements come from the networking of our minds rather than the individual knowledge, talent, or skill. Does this mean that we should favor population growth, something that thinkers have been afraid of? Or should we favor interconnectedness that comes from technology?
On the whole, it's interconnectedness that counts, not the absolute number of people. Um, or rather, yeah, if there were only 100 people on the planet, then it would be better to have 200. But if there are 7 billion, would it be better to have 14 billion? I don't think so. I think at that stage, the problem is not the limit is not the number of people, it's how well connected they are. The evidence for the connectedness of people being terribly important comes from some really nice examples. My favorite one is the case of Tasmania. Tasmania became an island 10,000 years ago when rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age cut it off from the Australian mainland. And for 10,000 years, the people who had been living on this peninsula found themselves isolated and they had no contact with the nearby continent. And the result was that they didn't share in some of the ideas that happened on the nearby continent. They didn't get the boomerang, for example, which was invented after Tasmania was cut off, because that idea, the idea of the boomerang, could diffuse across Australia, but it couldn't reach Tasmania. Not only that, they actually had to give up some of the technologies they already had. By the time the 19th century came along and they were contacted by Western sailors, they had fewer technologies than they had had at the start. Bone tools, for example, nets, things like that, had been lost as technologies. Why? Because a population of only 4,000 people on the whole island was simply too small to sustain the specialized skills to keep some of these technologies alive. It's sort of hard to imagine, but you can sort of think of it as if you and I and 100 other people were plonked on a desert island, how many of the devices that we think of as essential today would we be able to make among ourselves? We couldn't make an iPhone, but we probably couldn't even make a penknife very well between us. So you need more people, but above all, you need people talking to each other. So I sometimes put it a bit facetiously. I say 100 stupid people in a room talking to each other will achieve more than 100 clever people in a room not talking to each other.
And that seems to be a good way to put it. So let's talk about great men. I've heard you say that even the most individual of achievements, Shakespeare's writings, the discovery of the light bulb by Thomas Edison, or even Darwin's theory of natural selection, are actually attained by teams of different minds. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, uh, Edison is the classic example of this. Thomas Edison ran huge teams of innovators. He regarded innovation as a product, set up a factory to produce it. And he deliberately had people doing thousands and thousands of experiments to come up with innovation. He didn't pretend to be a genius coming up with the idea on his own. And indeed, he famously said, invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. In other words, it's hard work that gets you there. So that's a very clear example. Darwin is more of an individual because he was a rather lonely person who thought a lot and wrote a book which had enormous influence on the world all alone. But it wasn't really alone because he was a fanatical correspondent. He would write to people all over the world saying, I hear that you have specimens of certain kind. Can you tell me about them? I've got this thought. Can you tell me about it? What is your evidence for this and that? He was drawing on a gigantic network of people, and he was just very good at being the spider in the center of a huge web. Um, William Shakespeare, I think, is a unique genius in the sense that his way with words and his insights into human nature are second to none. They are, I think, some of the greatest works in the English language, at least. Um, but even he was part of a team who were running a theatre, and he was presumably bouncing early drafts of his scenes off his fellow actors who would say, this bit doesn't work, that bit doesn't work. And then his sources for all his plays, he was plagiarizing other people's stories nearly all the time. You can find where he got the sources of most of his stories from, and he was building on what other poets had done before him and other playwrights. He couldn't have done it all from scratch. So even someone as brilliant as Shakespeare was the product and the sum of all these many influences upon him.
So we're all building upon each other, and that kind of goes into the interconnectedness because without the work of other people, without other people's minds, we wouldn't be able to progress. Now I kind of want to move on to something a little bit darker. So, in the mix of all of this progress we've had, we also have stuff like the rise of Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, other horrible dictatorships. How come the networking of our minds that produced so much greatness can't stop stuff like this?
That's a really good question, and if I knew the short answer to that, I would have I would be king of the world, I suppose. Um, uh, the Human beings aren't all good. They have a lot of bad in them, and they have habits which lead to the rise of bad people. One of their habits is to constantly turn people into gods, to treat certain people as superhuman, and put them on a pedestal and worship them. In the old days, you literally turned them into a god. People like Augustus Caesar said, "Look, I've now become a god," and everyone believed him. Um, but in the 20th century, something about the technologies of communication, in particular the use of radio, and the economic conditions of the time, enabled populist demagogues to exploit this human tendency to worship or follow strong men, even if the strong men were recommending that you do things that were unspeakably cruel and evil. And uh, this has happened before, and it will probably happen again. But there was a particular spasm of it happening very badly in the 20th century. Hitler and Stalin and Mao stand uniquely above all others in the number of people they killed through their personality cults and their obsessions and their paranoias and so on. Now, all of that was possible even in an improving world. And by the way, life expectancy and health did improve in the 1930s, even in the 1940s, unless you were killed, of course, and unless you were put in a concentration camp, etc. So, um, uh, it was possible, and when it ended, when the Second World War ended, the world quickly began to improve itself very dramatically and to shake off these terrible, terrible habits. So it was possible to escape from these bad habits. But I think it's very important that a rational optimist like me should not be trapped into saying, oh, things can only get better. Things can't ever get worse. Because in 1900 or 1910, you might have said that and you would have been wrong. For a lot of people, they did get worse. And likewise today, I think we will see, I very clearly say in my book, we will see horrific events in the 21st century. I even say I think there'll be pandemics, um, but they will not be enough to derail the human tendency to improve the world. One of the reasons why I think is because we can do good things in the open, but we have to do bad things a bit secretly. Um, you have to suppress the media and so on if you want to be a real dictator. Whereas uh, once you let the sunlight in, you can do as much good as you like, and you don't have to hide it from people.
Huh. So, what is the proper role of government, if any, of promoting the environment that allows for maximization of human achievement?
It's a really good question, and clearly, government has many roles. its government's origin is to monopolize violence, to say other people can't do violence. If somebody kills your friend, you don't take revenge. You go to the government and say, "Please, will you imprison the person who killed my friend?" So government does that for you, and it must do that fairly and justly. And that's its first and most important role, is to enforce the law. And that includes the law on property as well as the law on violence. And it includes uh, the fairness of exchange too. Government must hold the ring, as they say, must keep things fair when people are exchanging. It doesn't have to do this as much as it sometimes thinks. On the whole, the shopkeeper does not want to cheat you because he wants you to come back next week to his shop. Um, and therefore, he's not interested in trying to rip you off. He's interested in trying to give you such a good deal that you'll come back next week, but not such a good deal that he goes broke. So a lot of the fairness of trade can be relied upon to emerge without government telling people what to do. But to some extent, you do need government to enforce that as well. Beyond that, I think government can do active things that help the world happen by setting standards, for example, um, rather than standing back and letting anything happen. So by coming in and saying, look, everybody's going to use the same shape electric plug, or everyone's going to use the same something or other, that can be helpful if the government steps in and imposes a standard on an industry. I've seen cases where that can be done. Um, but government says only we will decide what kind of money you can use. Is that really necessary? Why should government take that decision? Why couldn't you and I use cryptocurrencies if we want instead? Or indeed barter or jelly beans or whatever it is we want to use as a currency. But government is very jealous of its monopoly on currency, and I think it goes too far in that respect.
What do you think is the role of government, if there is a role, in promoting science?
I think there is a role for government in promoting science, um, but not as big a one as we think there should be. The reason we think government must pay for science is because we think nobody else will pay for it if government doesn't. There's no good evidence for that proposition. There's lots of evidence that people will pay privately for science, partly because they think they can profit from it, and partly because they just love it, because they think it's a form of expression of human civilization, like they will pay for art in the same way. And I think we forget that sometimes, science for me is the greatest human achievement of all. And it would be wonderful to be able to have it, and I would be prepared to pay for it to some extent. But given that government takes 40% or so of my money off me, and the average person's money off you, as I'm saying there, not I'm not taking me specifically. I'm saying if I was the average person, um, and it would be a pity if it spent none of that on science. I'd like it to spend some of that on science, um, uh, on innovation, yes, on technology. Science in order that it can lead to innovation and technology, yes, to some extent, but not exclusively. And to a large extent, if you look at the way government funds science, it talks about it as fuel for innovation. I don't think that's the justification for science. I think the justification for science is that it's fascinating in its own right. I don't want to have to tell people who are studying black holes or deep geological time or the structure of genes that they must only do things that are of practical use to humanity. I want them to come up with mind boggling facts and poetic truths about the world that I can enjoy. So I wish government, when it does fund science, would do so less utilitarianly and more just because it's a good thing to do.
You have a new book coming out in May, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
My book in May is called How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. And it's an attempt to really get to the bottom of what is this strange phenomenon called innovation, which we're so dependent upon to produce prosperity, but which we don't really understand. We don't know why it happens, when and where it does. Um, we don't know why it happens in some industries and not others. Um, it's really quite mysterious. We can't cause it to happen very easily. Some policies seem to help it, some policies don't, but we don't really know how you switch it on and off. And yet, it's one of the most important facts about the world. And my way of tackling this question was to sit down and write down the stories about great innovations that changed the world: the steam engine and the search engine, vaccines and vaping, you know, lots and lots of different things from 300 years ago and from yesterday. Artificial intelligence and the number zero, which was invented nearly 1,000 years ago, nearly 2,000 years ago, um, and is a very important part of mathematics. But it was an innovation that came up at a certain point. Suitcases with wheels on. Um, why were these invented when and where they were? Sliced bread. Why was sliced bread invented in Missouri? I don't know the answer, but I pose the question. So my method in the book is to tell lots of stories and let the patterns emerge from the stories, see the similarities between these stories. And I think it's worked quite well as a book, and partly because people like reading stories. So see whether you can agree when you get a chance to read it.
I'm very excited to be reading your book when it comes out. And for everyone listening, you should read it too. Read his other books too. They're very good, very informative, make you think. That's it for today. Thank you so much for being on my show. It was a pleasure.
Juliet, I'm very grateful to you for inviting me on the show and asking such penetrating and sometimes difficult questions. It was a really enjoyable conversation for me. And congratulations on doing your podcast.
Thanks.